At the end of the week, we've got to figure out what the president accomplished.
The Dan York State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Takeo Comfort Solutions.
I don't think anybody can suggest that the itinerary wasn't a big one to go after with President Trump. Certainly historic on a couple different levels. What the substantial work was, I'll leave that to some really brilliant minds that have arrived here on set. Professor Marc Genest and Professor Richard Arenberg from the Naval War College and Brown University, respectively, each of whom are here talking on their own, of course, with their own analysis. Friday nights, we kind of spread it out a little bit. We forego the rundown in case anything really happens on a Friday that we miss, because we record the show on Thursday. We catch up on Monday. Although Memorial Day is a holiday, and we will replay conversations that we've recently had with Senator Whitehouse and former Senator and Governor Chafee on the Monday program. Now that we've got some housework accomplished, let's offer the latest that we had at press time or production time on the Trump trip, and then have a roundtable.
President Trump held private meetings with European leaders, including France's newly elected president, Emmanuel Macron, at the NATO summit in Brussels.
All over the world they're talking about it, and we have a lot to discuss, including terrorism.
NATO has agreed to join the Obama-era coalition to fight ISIS, but stopped short of waging direct war against the extremist group. Following his face-to-face meeting with the president, the head of the European Council said disagreement lingers over Russia.
I am not 100% sure that we can say today, we means Mr. President and myself, that we have a common position, common opinion about Russia.
The president, who once called NATO obsolete, also wants additional forces to join the roughly 8,400 U.S. troops in Afghanistan. President Trump and UK Prime Minister Theresa May had a cordial visit here at the White House earlier this year, but their next meeting could be contentious. British officials are upset with the U.S. over the publication of leaked evidence, photographs from the scene of the Manchester terror attack.
I will make clear to President Trump that intelligence that is shared between our law enforcement agencies must remain secure.
Protesters demonstrated against President Trump's visit outside the U.S. Embassy in Brussels.
So the Prime Minister kind of waxed, by the way, welcome, gentlemen, no strangers to the set. I just kind of roll in with these guys. Is Trump getting a bad rap here on the intel stuff?
As unlikely as that sounds, I think at this point, yes, he is, because he's complaining about leaks in his own administration and the intelligence community specifically. So this is standard operating procedure. Look, the United States is the only ship of state that leaks from the top down, and the executive branch is the main place where you derive most of the leaks. And this is a common occurrence. So the British are being a bit disingenuous here.
Yeah, well, I basically agree with that. I mean, I think...
and neither one of us, I think Mark's probably been a little bit, I don't know, Trump empathetic in analysis. Is that not, no?
I try to be as objective as possible.
Well, you are. I think, listen, objectivity is a goal, not always a successful thing. Yeah. But the reason I interrupted Rich is because you've been no fan.
Right.
And me, I think if people watch the show, I think you get it. So for you to say, yeah, you know, Mark is probably right that he's getting a tough rap here.
Well, in this particular narrow instance, yes.
In this particular, terror attack, intel type of thing. I wonder, though, if in the midst of the pain and the difficulty that the Prime Minister is having in all the feelings that bubble up having been hit, and in all of that, that there isn't a little bit of back of mind messaging that she's articulating when it comes to the president, meaning other things that they've been trying to roll with, giving him a whack on just stability is kind of coming through. Does that make any sense to you? Do you know what I'm saying?
Well, I grew up working in politics, and what politicians do best is deflect. And I suspect that Theresa May is looking for someone to take some of the burden off of what's happening. Because she's under a tremendous amount of pressure. And remember, this happened
based
under
on
her watch.
security information
Exactly.
that they had hours before.
So if I can deflect and find a scapegoat, for at least momentarily anyway, I think that's a smart political move on her part.
You know what? That's gross.
You mean a politician acting like a politician?
Well, yeah, on some levels, authenticity, I think, is most required by constituents on either side of the pond when tragedy hits. I mean, you want as authentic a response as you can possibly generate. Not possible?
I'm cynical. I mean,
we just went from empathetic to objective to cynical. I don't know where we're going to be at the end of this show. Tell me what your take is on this tour that the president's been on for this over a week now.
Well, I think at least in the early part of the tour, it's a low bar, but he's demonstrated the ability to stay on script and look reasonably presidential and not commit any tremendous missteps. We'll see how the end of the trip plays out. I think it's going to be tougher, ironically enough, with our European allies. I think there's a lot more friction there.
I think we saw some of that in the package.
Well, look, I'm going to give Trump some credit here, and that's not easy for me to do. The initial part of his trip, where he goes to Saudi Arabia and then he goes to Israel, was actually a very cunning strategy on his part. He is trying to unify the Sunnis against the threat of the Shia Iran, and also trying to get them to coalesce against an anti-Daesh strategy. And in that regard,
Daesh meaning ISIS.
Well, yeah, Daesh is the acronym that
Right.
the Arabs use to describe.
Right.
It's actually an insult, so that's why I use it.
Right.
It means to stamp out others, opponents of your views. So in that regard, he has tried to mend relationships with the Sunnis after the Obama administration because of the Obama administration's strategy with negotiating for a nuclear arms agreement with the Shia Iranians. So in that regard, he's repairing some of the damage of the last administration, and that can be a constructive avenue for him to take. And as Rich pointed out, he's been very disciplined for Donald Trump, staying on message, which can show you how effective a president can be if they remain disciplined and mature in the way they speak to the public.
And tightly scheduled.
Yes.
So no time for tweets, for the most part, and one of the difficulties apparently in the White House has been that he's got too much downtime, and that it provides the opportunity for some of his undisciplined behavior to surface.
Which kind of belies this notion that he promotes, that he's working so hard, he's constantly working, and there is this kind of scuttle that he's got a lot of time on his hands. I don't know if that means because Melania's in New York a lot, and who knows how we can evaluate that whole situation.
Right.
But let's talk about the trip as it goes. So Saudi and then Israel, of course, a couple of missteps along the way, minor ones perhaps, this cough up of the, I never mentioned Israel, to the Russians when I was in there. That's like a teenager's mistake, coming home and kind of spitting out that they were at, I wasn't at the party. Bombed that. Well, I didn't ask you if you were at the party. What party? You know what I mean? I don't know if it's exactly similar, but right? Not good.
Well, again, my views don't represent the United States Navy or any Department of Defense. This is a remarkably immature man. And we've never seen a situation in which an individual who lacks the kind of discipline and the kind of orderly intellect that you need to be a leader. And this is a very unusual thing because he's a charismatic individual, but he's a showman. And he's great at marketing because he's not afraid to say things that push to the edges. And that works in the business community, particularly when you're about branding your name. But as a president, it's much different. And the repercussions can be much more serious. And this is the big problem that Donald Trump has to overcome to become a successful president.
He would suggest that he's just rewriting the way a president operates. He might find out that rewriting the way a president operates is going to leave him in a real tough spot, in the country in a tough spot.
He
right?
appears to be almost entirely in the immediate moment at all times, so that it's one of the reasons why there's so little consistency with what he said in the past, and why there isn't a lot of forethought about where he's going in the future, and particularly in the matter of the proper handling of classified information, for example. That's particularly dangerous because he's so apt to be offhand in the moment.
Benjamin Netanyahu at least puts on a pretty good show about how much he likes him.
Well, again, it's relative. There was he had a difficult relation with President Obama, and a lot of it had to do with his relations with Iran. And Netanyahu felt that President Obama did not support Israel to the extent that he should have. So now he sees essentially a clean slate with Donald Trump, someone that he can kind of steer in the right direction. And besides, Trump on the campaign trail was avowedly pro-Israel. So this is a malleable ally, which is something that we all want in an ally. Right. So it's a positive step.
So, but at the end of the day, for this segment, guys, give me a few seconds on this. Is there anything traction-wise between the Palestinians and the Israelis that we've actually accomplished here at all?
Well, negotiations start off with symbolic moves. Sadat's trip to Israel. You start with symbolism, and then you gradually develop an environment so that you can negotiate serious matters. So this is step one, which is the easiest step. It's whether or not you can go into step two, and whether or not the principal negotiators, the Palestinians and the Israelis, are ready to make the kind of compromises you need to get to a serious agreement.
All right. When we come back, we'll talk about what was happening at home while the president was doing his trip. Stay with us.
Have you talked about this issue with Admiral Rogers?
I would like to withhold that question at this particular point in time.
In those kind of scenes this week with the National Intelligence Director and others that we'll play for you here, it provided a split screen opportunity, at least for the press, to keep digging away and digging away. Never mind what Congress is doing, working effectively. But here the president is trying to, do his thing. I want the president to be able to make effective change in the world. But he's out there doing his thing, and back here at home, the thing is not good. If he had been home watching some of the testimony, he would have been losing his mind, don't you think? I mean, it would have been a tweeting machine. Right? Agree?
Yeah, absolutely.
So what was your take on what was going on back here at home?
Well, I think he's in serious trouble back here at home. I mean, whether or not we're yet talking about President Trump as an individual, but certainly the difficulties that he has with his administration, both on the legislative front and in terms of the ongoing investigation. I mean, the appointment of a special counsel was incredibly significant. We have some history with special counsels and independent counsels, and they very rarely find nothing to prosecute.
Yeah, I'm not sure why we're playing Mr. Putin there, but of course it's got to do with Russia. That's right. I was still on the road in my mind. Between the Coates testimony and the former CIA director's testimony, it left this feeling like Donald Trump is perpetually trying to stymie this Russian investigation. And what I can't figure out is whether he's just, to your point, immature, clumsy, can't figure out what the real role or what the system is, or whether he's really trying to hide something. I mean, it would be ironic if he ends up losing his gig, not for what he did, but for what he did, not knowing that what he was doing to try to stymie it was something he couldn't do.
Covering up a non-crime.
I think actually this speaks to he's a neophyte, and neophytes make mistakes like he's making. I wonder if his best defense is going to be, look, I wasn't trying to impede the investigation. I was just saying Mike Flynn is a good guy, and he's resigned, so can we end this now? And I think that's actually a relatively believable defense on his part. In order to prove obstruction of justice, you have to prove intent. And I don't see him improving intent, and that Donald Trump can easily get out of this, not easily, but get out of this by just claiming, look, there was a misunderstanding, Flynn resigned, I was just trying to move on and get my administration to talk about taxes and jobs.
But it seems to me there's I wouldn't say it's perpetual, but there's this ongoing, okay, Comey he puts the finger on, and at least Comey's notes would show that. And then you've got Coates that is saying, look, I can't, I'm not talking about this. So clearly there's some leaking coming out of his environment, right, about what he was asked to do. And so you've got at least 3 folks here who say, I've had some uncomfortable and/or inappropriate conversation with Donald Trump about the FBI investigation on Russian intervention into the election. Is there nobody, the question becomes again, is there nobody around him to say, Mr. President, sit down. This is the last time I'm going to tell you. These things are inappropriate and illegal in the world of Washington.
I want to go back to your question about whether this was immaturity or whether there's something really significant here being covered up. I think part A, the immaturity, I think that's absolutely clear. I think that's indisputable. The second part, we don't really know yet, but his exposure, now that there's a qualified, respected special counsel on the case with the freedom to broaden that net, I mean, we may not be looking in the right place yet. I mean, I think there are some indications, for example, that the investigation will go towards following the money. In other words, what's Trump's exposure in terms of financing from Russia?
Well, no tax release returns and more specificity on his investments, obviously, is going to be something that would give a special counsel a salivating disposition, correct?
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
I'd follow the money and then follow Flynn. If Flynn's already negotiating behind closed doors, he has a story to tell, and if he wants to plea, that story's got to be juicy.
All right, so when we come back, I want to talk about what Professor Arenberg is saying here, though, because special counsels are in one direction and come up with stained dresses. I mean, at what point is it just they're there to find something no matter what? Stay with us.
I was worried by a number of the contacts that the Russians had with U.S. persons. I know what the Russians try to do. They try to suborn individuals, and they try to get individuals, including U.S. persons, to act on their behalf either wittingly or unwittingly. I saw information and intelligence that was worthy of investigation by the Bureau to determine whether or not such cooperation or conclusion was taking place.
This was compelling testimony, and why the Republicans are trying to make him the guy that's got to answer questions about an investigation is beyond me. That's not what he does or did in his role at the CIA. And so it is amazing to me that Republicans and the Trump administration hadn't in the past and don't do now an all-in on being aghast about the whole thing and doing everything they can to say, we're naked, transparently, let's go, right? Or they can't.
Well, you know, there seems to be, look, if you look at it and just assemble the facts, there is a convergence of interests between the Trump campaign and the Russians. They had it out for Hillary. They wanted to do as much as they could to damage them, and it was in Trump's interest for them to do as much damage as possible. And whether or not there was actual direct collusion between the Trump administration and the Russians with giving them information about the WikiLeaks, or more likely, though it's still possible I'm wrong, that the Trump administration was merely exploiting the WikiLeaks that were promoted by Russia. That is something that you would expect any candidate to do.
But there's also some Brennan type of testimony that kind of inferred that there was a lot of unwitting problematic behavior on the part of the Trump campaign interacting with the Russians.
Right.
Perhaps everybody, including the Trump campaign, never thought they would win. If Hillary Clinton had won the election, this stuff would be on a low simmer.
Right.
I mean, it would be going, but it would be on a lower simmer.
But we'd still be investigating emails.
Yes.
But if the Republicans, if it was still a Republican Congress, we'd have a select committee on emails.
I mean, is this a situation you think that between the Russians and the Trump campaign, both of them kind of looked at each other, or either in the same space or in separate spaces, but looked at the world and went, holy cow, we won.
But if there's
like the Russians don't care, right? I mean, the Russians aren't going to be brought to justice in America.
No, but look, the Russians are very, very patient, and it looks like there's some evidence that they have been, digging in fertile soil with members that were either closely associated or tangentially associated with the Trump campaign. And this is, business contacts, loaning money to individuals. And I suspect, exactly what Rich said, follow the money and you're going to see some kind of financial arrangement or interaction between one actor and the Russians. And if that's the case, then that builds the collusion theory into a strong...
Talk to me about this. The Quinnipiac Poll just showed that now a majority of Americans believe that Donald Trump abused his power. Mm-hmm. That can't help legislative activity. That can't help domestic agenda. It can't help any of it.
Yeah, I think his legislative agenda is in very serious trouble.
The American Health Care Act, not a shot. Budget, the Senate leadership are saying DOA. I mean, there's a lot of...
There's no way that budget will ever see its way into law. No way at all. And we've got the need to lift the debt ceiling coming up. We've got a major budget negotiation, up against a government shutdown deadline coming up at the end of September. And you didn't mention the major tax bill. That's not going anywhere either.
All right, so with the minute that we have left, tell me, my thought prior to the break is, sometimes these investigations, because there's no deadline on them, just keep going and going and going and going. Is it fair to the Trump administration and the American people not to have a deadline on this sucker and to just kind of let this thing go and percolate and find something that might not even be relevant to the original concern that we have?
I think it would be constructive to have an end point, an end date. Because of that, the legislative agenda only goes so far as the president's ability to maximize his influence. And when his influence is reigning because he's under so much pressure, then his legislative agenda dies. Now that may be good. That maybe the Republicans can compromise with the Democrats on health care and stuff like that. But
there is a little more restraint because he's a special counsel appointed,
and a guy highly respected,
and appointed within the Department of Justice. So in theory, he still works for the president. He works for the Attorney General. He works for the Deputy Attorney General. And so that if it begins to go far afield, given the political circumstance, they can pull him in.
Well, he also works for the American people. And somewhere along the line, whether they like Donald Trump or not, we have to move forward, as they say. Guys, we could go all night. Thanks. Appreciate that. Final word on what's coming up program-wise next. Alrighty, coming up on Memorial Day, Senator Whitehouse revisited, and Senator Chafee as well. Whitehouse at 10:30, Chafee at 7:30 and midnight in our regularly scheduled programs. Enjoy your Memorial Day. Say thanks to a veteran. Good night.